And they say at the same time, no time will have passed. We just will continue where we left off. So that when there's no word for goodbye, so that when we say bonjour, bonjour, goding, I'll see you again sometime, and no time will have passed. We just will continue where we left off. There was no space in between that time. And so that's kind of how we look at it. No, there's no word for goodbye in that. I'll just see you when you left off, and we just continue where we left off. Like his stories. There's all kinds of stories about Wayne Boozhoo. There's all kinds of stories there too. A lot of humor and moral in the stories there too. And a lot of humor. My younger brother Andy here too. There's lots of stories about him there too. And you know, he's from the Red Cliff tribe. I'm from the Bad River tribe, but by Ashland, the Squamish Bay on Lake Superior. There too, and so he lives across the bay. That's where his relatives. But they were all one group at one time before they became split to reservations there too. But just thinking about tonight, you know, and I was sleeping last night and thinking about what was going to be saying tonight. And while I was sleeping, I had a dream, and I started dreaming really hard, and I was sleeping really hard, and I started dreaming that, thinking about what I was talking about and some of the topic areas. And one of them came up was, I said, started dreaming that I left this physical world and I went to the other side. And I was walking on the other side, and this, when I crossed over, the spirit came up to me, and he said, "Ozawanakota, being the gain, you know, Ibidikea, Gizibi, come across this river." So I came across, and I walked over there, and he said, "Ozawana, being the gain, Oma, come over here." So I went over by him and started talking to me. And he asked me a couple of questions. He said, you know, you live down there on that earth, Aki. And he said, you know, you walked around, you know, among the many different peoples. And did you teach them? Did you help them? I said, yeah, as much as I could. He said, you could have done more. I said, yeah, I know, I could have done more. I was younger, and, you know, I'm kind of misguided and went down different roads, and I could have done better. He said, yeah, he said, you could have. But he said, you know, the Chimokman people down there have what they call penance. Did you ever hear that? I said, yeah, I heard that. I went to that Catholic school, and I heard that word penance before. He said, well, we have something similar here too. You're going to have to do the same thing. So, oh, really? I said, okay. He said, you know, just to make up for things that you did down there. I said, okay, I'll do that. Whatever I have to do. So he said, I've been again. And I said, come over here. And then I was walking that way. And he said, to walk this way over here. And he walked over, and he said, well, what you're going to have to do, he said, you're going to have to walk with this lady here, you know, for half an eternity. So I said, well, it's what I got to do. He said, you walk hand in hand with her. I said, all right. So I walked over, and she was standing there, and I just, her hair in the back, and I was looking at her, this really scraggly, rough-looking hair. And I thought, man, she hasn't combed it in years, you know, all kinds of stuff in there. And I was watching her, and she turned around, and whoa, you know, and she was smiling real big, and she wasn't really pleasant to look at. And I said, whoa, 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 whoa. But she was smiling, you know, and he said, you got to walk with her hand in hand, you know, for half an eternity. I said, all right. So we started walking. I was walking with her hand in hand, and she was smiling and smiling away. And I was running into people that I'd seen before, you know, walking around there. And I was walking around and looking, seeing people, and walking with her, and she was smiling away. And I looked around and said, "Good day, Wobbin." I went, well, who's that? It reminds me of that. It's Andy. That's Andy Goki. And Andy was walking along. He was smiling away, you know. And he had this really beautiful Anishinaabe. Man, she looked good. It was an Indian woman. Really beautiful. And I thought, man, holy man. I thought, and Andy said, you know, he was twice as bad as I was down there. And look what I got to walk with, and look what he gets to walk with. I thought, you know, this ain't right here, you know. He used to drive those vans down. They called them sin bins, you know. And I thought, you know, I remember Andy in the younger days there. Man, he's worse than I was down there. I said, this ain't right. I said, well, I got to go talk to that head spirit again and find out what's going on here, you know. So I went over, and I finally found him, and I said, he said, looked at me. I used to get in here and said, well, what's going on? What's happening? How's you buying? I said, you know, I have a question. I said, you know, I admit that I didn't do everything I was supposed to do while I was down there on Earth, you know, and I have to walk with her for half an eternity, and that's what I got to do. I said, that's what I have to do. I said, you know, but I seen Andy, and there he is walking around this really beautiful woman, and he was worse than I was down there. I don't think that's fair. And so he just kind of looked at me and motioned me to come over by him. I went over there and he reached down and looked at me. He said, well, sonny, Ozawanakwan, even beautiful women have to do penance. So one of the things that we have in our language is a lot of stories, and we tease a lot. You know, there's a lot of teasing that goes on within the stories. And there's all kinds of stories. You know, the language is built upon stories because it was an oral tradition. And so there was always, like Wayne Boozhoo, there were stories about everything that you can think about. There's just stories. And so very oral in the process there too, talking about our history, who we are, where we're going. And so everything was built upon those stories. You know, we tell these stories, you know, continuously all over. The Nino Ozawanakwad Indigenous cause, you know, my name Ozawanakwad. I was given by an old man that talked about this dream that he saw, and just before the storm came, there was a yellow cloud that came in, and he saw that in his dream, Ozawanakwad. And so that's the spirit that came in there, and that was the name that he saw. And that's a name that when I attend our ceremonies, they are just referred to me as Ozawanakwad there, and so they don't use my English name; they just Ozawanakwad. And that's the name that I'm referred to. Sunny Gaye Indigo. I'm also called Sunny. That comes from my uncle, my mother's brother. He was my mother's older brother, and he was 18 years old, and he was killed in World War II in March in 1945, on the 5th day in that he was killed. He was 18 years old in the Marine Corps. And after he passed away, or died, and the old people on the reservation came to my grandmother, and they told my grandmother that they saw in a dream that she would have a grandson that would be born not too long after that, and that she needed to come to the ceremony because this grandson, like her son, was going to go west, and he was going to go over the ocean like her son, and he was going to go to a war like her son too, and she needed to come to the ceremony so that this wouldn't happen again. And so my relatives there used to call it the Sunny Madash. That was my uncle's name, Sunny Madash, Medueash, but Sunny Madash. And so they started calling it the Sunny Madash prophecy. And I was the first grandson born right after that. And so they just started to call me the Sunny Madash prophecy, but then just started calling me Sunny. And so then my grandma never called me Sunny. She always called me Jimmy. She wouldn't call me Sunny. You know, her Sunny was killed in World War II. And so she would never use that name. She always referred to me as Jimmy. My middle name was James. And so that became that prophecy. And when I turned 18 years old, Uncle Sam sent me a number. And in that number was a draft number and a day on a date. And I had number 23, and they were taken in the lottery from 1 to 93. So I had number 23. But all my friends among our tribal people, many of them at that time would go into the service. It was a very important part of their value system there too, to be a warrior. And so many of them, my father, my cousins, uncles, everybody was in the service. And so all my friends were going in. So I just decided it was time for me to go in too. So I went in before the draft had me there too. But it all sort of came to the same passing as the way that they told my grandmother. I was the same age as my uncle. I went west, got to Fort Lewis, Washington, caught another plane over to Vietnam, went across the ocean, and then I came back. So my grandmother would watch on television. They would always have those little where things are happening around there, and she'd always want to know if I was in these areas. I'd say, no, I'm on the other side, or I'm not there, there too. But Sunny Gaye and Dagur, that's what I'm called, and that's a story of how that came to be. And I tell my sons that story too, because my great-great-grandfather's name was Bidikwash. He was born in 1831. He comes from the fish clan of Wasasi Dudayam. And so that was the clan that I belonged to, was the fish clan. We have about 5 major clans, and then we have a number of sub-clans underneath there too. And the fish clan is where your teachers and your philosophers and your seers come from. We have our leaders come from our Crane and Loon clan. We have the Bear clan, which is sort of the herbal and the police there too. And we have the Deer clan, where the sort of the poets and the hunters they came from. And the Wolf clan were the thinkers and the warriors there too. Each clan was like a society. You have your doctors and your lawyers and your teachers, and you have all these things that you would do. And so my clan is the fish clan, the Wasasi Dude and the Bullhead clan. And so that's where our teachers, our philosophers, and our seers, come from that particular clan there too. And that's part of who I am too, and that's a story. So my great-great-grandfather, Avidikwash, that was his Indian name. And in 1887, when they were doing out the Allotment Act, they had to divide up the reservation. They were trying to make farmers out of tribal people. So rather than have a collective group, they divided all the land into 16, 80, 100 acres. They divided it all up that way. And so my grandfather, when the Indian agents came, needed to have a name on the piece of paper for that would allot him his 180 acres or 160 acres. And so when he got there, they used to call him the old smart man, because he could speak English, but he was also a clan leader too. And so he could speak English, and they would talk to him. They used to calling him the old smart man. And so when they had to give out a name, they just said, well, here comes old smart man. So they just gave him the last name, Smart Man. And then they named him Peter also too, because he was a clan leader, and they thought about the 12 apostles, and they thought about Peter. So they named him Peter Smart Man. And then his children, my great-grandfather Jim and his brothers, they just knocked off the name Man and just kept the last name Smart. So that's a story that I've told my boys that. So my boys, ever since they were real small, and I'd read stories to them and talk to them in Indian, I would tell them that story. And so at this point in time in their life, they know that story. And so they know from Bidikwash and it goes back further than that. But it goes to me, and then they continue on with the story now too. So they know where their clan comes, where it came from there too. That's their story. And then their names, each one of them, Minogijik, Wabinganyugijik, Bimaset Gijik, they each have their own name, their own story too. And so they know that story. So we tell them that. I tell them that as part of that. My sons, I talk to them in Indian, but they talk to me in English. They understand me in Indian, but they'll talk to me in English, but they will understand me, so I can do that with them. That's because English is so powerful and prevalent around us there too. And our young children, developmentally want to be like others around them, so they take on those values, those beliefs to be like them there too. So it's hard for them to do that, and that's what many of our Indigenous people have dealt with there too. Not just personally at that personal level, but there's also at a macro level too, where things have started to happen there too. But a few other things here I mentioned before. Indigenous cause was Wanaka Indigenous cause. Again, you can say Anin. Over in Minnesota, they say Anin. Around Wisconsin, they use Boozhoo. Once you get over to Anin, when you get over to Minnesota, they use Anin. They use it for hello and hi at the same time there too. But Anin can also mean what too at the same time. So some individuals say, time I see them, they always say what. It just says that too, because they say Anin. They do that in there too. But Sanigai do, as I mentioned before, Sanigai Indigo. But we live in Ojibwa is a very verb-structured language. About 75% are verbs, about 25% are nouns. And so that verb structure is very action-oriented, verb, adjectives, and descriptive. And basically, when they talk in India many times to a concept, in English it's about this much. In Indian, it's about that much, because they're describing to you what they see, what's going on. It's an action verb, and so sometimes it takes more to describe it. If they were talking, you would say this room is a noun, but if they came in and looked at it, they would describe everything that's in this room. They're talking about the color, the chairs, the floor, the lights, and everything that they see around you. So that's going to take a lot more to describe that. What they're trying to do for you is paint a picture for you. It's a very feeling-oriented picture. So if you got a picture and you got the object there too, you talk about the object at the noun, but for them, they're using the whole picture, all the context around the particular object, so that all that becomes very, very important in the process there too. So sometimes that they talk about the topic here, and they got to describe everything that's going on around the particular topic. And it's a way of communication. It's very verb structured. And it's also very similar to gender communication too. So you take a look at males and females, when they talk. Just in English, for example, not all females do that, but many females do. If they talk about the topic and they start here, they talk a lot about the context. And then they finally get to the topic. Males, on the other hand, they like to go straight to what's going on. And it's like cooking or anything. And it's even physiological too. Physiological, if you take a look at, just like if you talked about sex, for example, a friend of mine said, well, women are like crock pots and men are like microwaves. So what do you mean? And he said, well, women, it takes them a while to heat up. Men are like microwave zap, they got it right away. And you can see that as a communication process there too. Sometimes men do it too. A man comes back from fishing, tells his wife, honey, I got the fish, whole big string. Good, you got the fish, put them in the sink, we'll clean them up and freeze them. No, I got to tell you how I got them. No, you got the fish, good. No, I got how I got on the boat, and I took the boat out to the lake, and here's all the tackle I had, and here's all the waves I went around, and I had a cast, and I had to pull them in, and he's got to tell the whole story how he got the fish. She says, I don't need to hear the story. You got the fish? Good. Put them in the sink, clean them, that's in the story. No, I got to tell you about the story. So women, the same process, do the process, talk about the context. That's very important. Men don't want to hear the context. They can go right to the solution or go right to the main point and they know what's going on. And that happens in the language too. A friend of mine named Ernie St. Germain's older brother of mine, when we talk, we do a lot of different things, work together on the curriculum and different things. And as we write these things down, Ernie will get to talk to what we need to, but Ernie will do this. And I've over 25 years, almost 30 years, I've tried to speed him up, but I have yet to be able to speed him up. That's the amount of time that it takes. And Ella was talking, whatever amount of time it takes was the amount of time that was going to take her. I was not going to speed her up. That's the amount of time that it takes to get to that point. So I'm used to that. So it doesn't really bother me that it happened there too. But it's cultural tied to the language. That's important to relay that because they want to relay the picture. So if you get a feeling tends to last much longer than a cognitive perspective. You get the feeling for it, you retain it because you feel it. But if it's cognitive, it kind of comes in and out, in and out, in and out. And so the chances are less that you're going to retain it unless you do roll over and roll. But feelings tend to stay very strongly because you got a picture in your mind and the process, and the language is built, like the process there too. And so the verb structure of the language is built upon that process there too. So I mentioned verb structured language. It doesn't work. Ella broke it.
Oops, no.
That was teasing her. Or don't work, does it broke? I have no idea. There we go. Well, there we go. But we'll just do that. Okay. We'll do it manually with the fingers there too. But Anishinaabe, Mowen, Ojibwe language. The root word Anishinaabe means original people. And most tribes have some particular definition of how they refer to themselves as the first people, the original people. But that's what we use for Anishinaabe. Anishinaabe means the first people, the original people, but also refers just to people at the same time, Anishinaabe. So each one of you would be Anishinaabe. I'm Ojibwe Anishinaabe, so that you might be German Anishinaabe, Polish Anishinaabe. You are a human being. That's what that primarily means, they're a human being. Then you put the name in front of that, whatever that's going to be there. And so Anishinaabe, but also comes from an Algonquian language. In the United States here, there's a number of major indigenous language groups. One of the language groups that prominent one in this particular area, Great Lakes, there is the Algonquian there. And Algonquian, again, there's a lot of subgroups underneath there. Some of those subgroups are the Menominee there and the Three Fires. The Three Fires, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa. You talk about the Three Fires. So in each one of them refer to themselves as Anishinaabe. And if you can speak Ojibwe, you can, if you're fluent speaking Ojibwe, it'll take you a couple days, but you can understand Potawatomi. If you're a fluent speaker in Potawatomi, it doesn't take you long to understand Ojibwe or Odawa. Very similar to English. You get different dialects of English all over the place. So if you go in Appalachia, and you get up there, and their particular speech, for example, is about 1.75, the space between the time that people talk. American English is about 1 second, but up there is about 1.75. So it's much more slower in the communication. And the same thing with Ojibwe too. You have some that speak a little bit more, and certain dialects of Spanish talk faster. And the same thing with English. You talk a little bit faster, a little bit slower. But some of the dialects might be very slow, and also add different accents or different terminology. And first, when you get there, you can understand them, but not quite. But if you hang around them for about 3 or 4 days, you'll pick it up, that English, and pretty soon you can talk exactly, understand what they're talking about there too. Or if you go to England, you go to Australia, same thing will happen there too. They say things differently, but you'll be able to pick it up after you're there for a little while there too. That's the same dynamic that happens with Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Odawa, as well as Meskwaki, which live over in Iowa, Shawnee. These are all Algonquin dialectically. They're a little bit different there too. A friend of mine were down in Tama, and the Sauk and Fox are Meskwaki in Tama, Iowa. I went down there for a funeral, and they talk real fast, and you got to listen to them very strongly. And as I listen to them, I'm trying to figure something out, and by the time I figure that out, he's about a minute ahead of me. So then I've lost that part there too, so I'm trying to pick that up there too, because they go very fast. My grandmother used to say that she'd go up to Duluth, and people from Canada would come down, and she said they talk really fast. And then they would tell her, you talk really slow, and they try to speed her up, and she's trying to slow them down, but the dialects, they understand one another, but the one talk a little bit faster and a little bit more slower in the process there too. So that's part of that. In Wisconsin here, Menominee is also an Algonquin language, very similar to Ojibwe. It's verb structured, animate, inanimate, and many words are very similar, but also a little bit different there too. One of my uncles that in the ceremonial drums talked about that the Ojibwe people, he said, Mewija, passed through this Great Lakes area a long time ago. He said they came from the west and they passed through this Great Lakes on their way to the Great Sea in the east. And the Great Lake where they went there was salt. And that's where they were on their way to. He said, but some stayed here. And he said that some of the Menominee people stayed here. And so the rest of the tribe continued on to the east coast by Nova Scotia. And then about 1300, they started having another dream and prophecy that people were going to come from across the ocean. So they had to move fairly quickly and to move away from that because something was going to happen. They wouldn't be around. So they left. And they started migrating through the Great Lakes all the way through the St. Lawrence, through the Great Lakes up in here. And they were going to go to where they would kind of settle where food grows on water. And that became wild rice. And so they came to this point here. And so they're here. But also many of the tribes that stayed in the east are no longer here. We'll talk about some of the tribes and languages that are no longer here. The Stockbridge, for example, are part of that. They are on the Menominee Reservation. Menominee Reservation, they were going to remove them to Minnesota, but Oshkosh, Chief Oshkosh was able to convince them to the president. He made a trip to Washington, convinced the president to keep the tribe here. And they had 10 townships, and he gave 2 townships of those he gave to the Stockbridge, because the Stockbridge were also in the Delaware, were in the New England area, and some of the priests, ministers there, because they were decimated by tribes. There were very few of them, and they were still suffering a lot of different types of prejudice, discrimination, and things going on. So they kind of took them groups of remnants and brought them over to Wisconsin here. And there's a Stockbridge right on Lake Winnebago, and that's the first town that they stopped there, and John Stockbridge brings them that far. But they needed a place to live, and the Menominee gave them 2 townships. So when you look on the Menominee Reservation, it's kind of square, but on the lower southwest side, there's a little square, there's the Stockbridge Reservation, what the Menominee gave to the Stockbridge to be able to live there too. The Menominee also had areas around Green Bay, and that was part of their original territorial area. But the Oneida were also suffering the same things that were happening to the Stockbridge, and the missionaries came here too, and also were able to ask the Menominee if they could reside there at the mouth there by Green Bay, and that's the Oneida Reservation there too. So Oneidas in Stockbridge again are relocated from the New York area and Great New England area there too. And the Ho-Chunk Menominee are the two oldest tribes here in Wisconsin. Ho-Chunks, one of the Ho-Chunk elders talked about they lived in the southwest where the Great Salt Lake, but they had the same prophecy too. And so they kind of moved west and up to Mississippi and then up to Wisconsin. But the same type of prophecy too, that if they weren't careful that they would lose a lot of their language and different things would happen to them there too. Ho-Chunk, the Oneida in Ojibwa, entirely different. They're part of the Iroquoian linguistic stock there too. It's like German and English. It's just entirely different there. Stockbridge is a number of different groups, or Algonquian too, but there's about 3 different tribes that they brought here there too. And then Ho-Chunk, again, is also a part of the Siouan group. Like if you talk Lakota or Sioux, very similar to Ho-Chunk. My wife is half Ho-Chunk and half Potawatomi. Ho-Chunk say pinigigi, pinigigi, or thank you, pinigigi. And Ojibwe say miigwech, as I mentioned before, miigwech and pinigigi. And so my wife, if we does something, she might say pinigigi. And I said, no, miigwech. No, ka. Pinigigi. I said, gawin. Miigwech. Ka. Pinigigi.